soul can make it into the life wave or the rope of consciousness of the earth unless it is through a woman's womb. I will say that one more time. No soul can make it into the life wave, which means the evolutionary flow of the earth, unless it comes through a woman's womb. Okay, a female's womb. Okay, so let's get into why that is and dive into the foundation of the feminine mysteries, which is something that's called the descent of the Great Mother. I don't like to use the word fall for this because oftentimes we think of the fall of Eve. And the fall of Eve actually isn't really a good story because the fall of Eve really highlights the end of the matriarchal age and sort of more of a negative connotation. We're going to go right back to the pure form of this, which is the descent of the Great Mother, the descent of Sophia, the descent of Inanna. Okay, and we can see that this is a major symbology in a lot of different myths. We have the descent of Inanna, which is more of a Sumerian Babylonian expression of basically the same myth as the dissension of this Great Mother essence. We have the fall of Sophia, the fall of Eve, and we have Alice going down the rabbit hole, or the Alice going down underground, falling through a rabbit hole underground. And we also have Persephone going into the underworld. So what is going on with all of this symbology in fairy tales? There's also the 7 princesses that go underground. So what is this myth about? What is this myth trying to tell us about ourselves, about our spirituality, especially as women? And it is that the first human civilization on this planet was actually a matriarchy. The very beginning of civilization was a matriarchy. And that was because there was this great dissension of Sophia, of the goddess, that colored early humanity. So there was actually a cosmic impulse that came down to the earth in early human development that can be known as the descent of the Great Mother. It first began as kind of a cosmic impulse, and it wasn't personified at all. But over time, that cosmic impulse was personified, and it did eventually materialize into actual female initiates from a higher sphere, materializing on the planet to help evolve humanity. These would have been called star people or star beings or something like that, probably in our language, but they probably would have been called goddesses in the earlier days. So there is a kind of a deeper truth to the myth of Persephone and the myth of Inanna and this descension into the underworld, or this descension down, that it goes a lot deeper than the idea that women are naturally psychic, or that we're going into these deeper states of consciousness, which is represented by going underground, going deep in the subconscious mind. It's really more than women being natural oracles and going into deep states of consciousness. It's actually the very real descension of the feminine impulse and the subsequent ritualistic practice of higher female initiates from higher spheres, a higher sphere, coming down to the earth in a very real human form. Okay, so some of the first real teachers on the planet were actually women. Okay, so how can you have this materialization process happen? So how can you have it just be this impulse that is hitting the planet that we would call the Sophia impulse, the divine feminine impulse? How can it hit the planet and then materialize into, over time, actual beings coming to visit? Now, what is that process like? Because that process sounds pretty crazy. Well, that is actually how the world evolves. That's how planets evolve. Planetary spheres evolve through the overlapping of each other. So what will happen is you'll have the Earth, which is a third dimensional planet, sometimes reaching a little bit higher than that in its higher points, but fundamentally a 3D planet. You have it here, and then its higher self, or the higher sphere, will actually begin to overlap it. And this is perceived as a specific impulse that is hitting the planet, or even certain cosmic rays that are hitting the planet. And this will actually cause a golden age, usually. Okay, it causes a great period of evolution. And so if you want to look at page 4 in your guidebook, there's a little image there of Venus and the importance of Venus. And of course, we're talking about not only the descent of Inanna, not only the descent of Sophia, but really at its core, we're talking about the descent of the planet Venus, the higher Venusian sphere overlapping with the Earth to create a higher evolutionary impulse. Okay, so how does this happen? So what we have is the Venusian sphere, which is seen as the higher self of the Earth. It's kind of seen as the etheric body of the Earth, the higher self of the Earth. So it is the Earth, but you could also see it experientially as like the future Earth. And so that overlaps with the Earth in a higher plane. And that causes an exchange to happen, kind of like a birthing process almost starts to go on between the two. And the first phase of that is actually going to be the migration of, I would say, spiritual forces. And stabilizing Venus is the Pleiades. So it actually kind of happens in chains of 3. So the first thing that happens is you have the Earth overshadowed by Venus. And the first thing that happens is you have these kind of Venusian Pleiadian forces come as spirits, and they start to work in the consciousness of man. So they'll start to basically merge with your higher bodies and begin to give you insight onto how to heal yourself, how to evolve. And it's kind of just a spiritual linking at that point. But it does cause this sort of jump in evolution, even at that spiritual level. It's kind of like lighting you on fire. It's kind of like lighting your energy body on fire. And it's preparing you for even later and further contact. Okay. And then so over time, at the center of the Earth, there is forming a deep connection between Venus and the Earth and its higher sphere. And you could even, if you wanted to, you could also see the Earth as a star within itself. And you could even see Venus kind of as a star within itself in a way. And at the core of the Earth, there is sort of what you would consider a black sun or a solar force. And it connects with the center of Venus. And so the center of the Earth will begin to connect very deeply with Venus. And that is actually how that Stargate technology works in its most advanced organic state. It is following a natural cosmic impulse. And these two planets can merge, and one planet is a higher version than the other. And that allows for these higher initiates to come down to the planet and help to evolve the culture, evolve the consciousness on the planet. Now, for the initiates coming here, this is part of them reaching a higher phase of evolution. You know, you have to provide service in order to reach that. So over time, what ends up happening once the spiritual level of the human being is saturated with the higher spiritual qualities of that overlapping sphere, eventually you'll have actual beings from that sphere begin to materialize. And they will sometimes be associated with coming from the inner earth or the center of the earth, because the center of the earth is actually a cosmic space. It's actually a stargate. So there's a lot of tales about, these ETs or these star people or these higher humans that are living in the earth, and even different layers of the inner earth carrying different qualities. And I think when we get into that conversation about the inner earth being an interdimensional space that has its own cosmic laws, I think we're getting really close to reality. And this may sound strange to you, like, these beings coming up from the inner earth and this sort of transmigration of beings. But again, this is how planets evolve. We have to be initiated by people that are kind of from our future, or by beings who have achieved something that we have not, or who have overcome something that we are looking to overcome. And so that's how we learn. And it is a great service for these. It was a great service for these females from Venus to come. It was a great sacrifice for them to come as well. People really were learning how to link themselves with higher worlds, and they were beginning to look up, and they were beginning to think of themselves as spiritual beings, as spiritual humans. And it was through these feminine teachers that they learned how interconnected everything was. And it was a very motherly impulse, and it was a lot through love, this sense of unconditional love, and how this unconditional love has this amazing, intelligent effect on other people, and that it is in itself an initiating force. And so that energy of love was really a very powerful and important initiating energy that these female initiates had to have. Okay, so to love humanity to the point that something awakened in them, the lighting of a flame. So this is really what these female initiates from Venus were doing, to love humanity to the point that something awakened in them. All right. So they were playing this role of the Divine Mother, and they were bringing humanity closer to their spirits. They were trying to assist humanity in how to connect with higher dimensions, and really give them the template of what they really were. Because at the time, humanity was sort of more in like almost like an animal state, and it was really only focused on survival. And so the idea was to lift humanity up from that state through love. But there was also, through love and through kind of initiations, to connect the lower bodies to the higher body and provide a blueprint. But there was another very, very important goal for these female initiates, or these goddesses or queens that were falling. And by the way, I should be clear that first, it was the Sophia impulse, cosmic impulse, the feminine, that fell or that descended. And I'm not talking about like a fall because you did something wrong. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Eve eating the fruit. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the calculated, willful descension of the female form. And that takes incredible mastery, because you are shattered and split into like a million different pieces when you do that. And so first it was the impulse of Sophia lighting the way, lighting this cosmic circuitry up from Venus to Earth. The feminine impulse descended and lit up this cosmic circuitry of a potential future of evolution. And then the female initiates had to fall into that circuitry, and they had to survive it, and they had to be able to maintain that. And there are specific initiation practices that they did on Venus to prepare themselves for that intense sacrifice, kind of similar to even what Christ did. But this is a female form of it. So there was a high priestess that fell first. And then after that, as time passed, more and more initiates came in a certain order as it became easier and easier to fall, and as the pathways became more and more bored, more and more easy to fall into. So there was a concise order of the female initiates that fell, from very exalted to then later on ones that were a little bit more early in their learning process. And the fall is all about time, okay? Getting the right time. It's about perfect timing in that way. And a secret about this is that the feminine is always the downward triangle, and it's always the downward materializing force. Well, yes, this is because in the history of the feminine on this planet, it involved higher women actually descending and actually materializing onto our planet. Okay, so the other goal of these female initiates, which they held as very important, was actually to create a lineage of children. And this lineage of children would be divinely born, or they would be conceived through the feminine mystery rite of miraculous conception, or parthenogenesis. Okay, so this is what they wanted to do. And there was a very specific reason why they wanted to conceive lines through holy birth. And that was because their eggs were not fallen. So they actually materialized from a higher realm onto the earth through intense levels of initiation. And so the eggs that they have within them were not of the earth. They were still of Venus and the Pleiades. They didn't destroy themselves or degrade themselves in any way to lower in dimension. They consciously descended. It wasn't a fall, it was a conscious descension, which is the goal for the female aspect of all of us, okay? So they wanted to establish a lineage on Earth. And this lineage on Earth would basically allow the higher traditions to continue, creating an upward evolutionary impulse for mankind. It would allow mankind to continue to evolve. And one day, as the lines that they were creating, one day even create a direct path of ascension, which we see the Christ did with his sacrifice. So this is the feminine side of those mysteries. And all of that was, in a way, laid out and decided with the fall of Sophia, okay? One of the things that they really wanted to do in particular was, it was very important for them to conceive a line of kings or males, because they were very aware that the time of the matriarchy and kind of their time as influential people would end. And they would have to go through this period of intense patriarchy. And they knew that they had to create a male line that could serve humanity in that time of patriarchy, because the feminine mysteries would disappear. And they were very aware of this. They were very aware that as the tides shifted and the earth moved from a matriarchy to a patriarchy, which is the natural flow and how we evolve as we move from positive to negative polarities in all ways, they knew that they would move into this patriarchal time, that the feminine mysteries would be degraded, that they would be lost almost entirely. And they knew that the only way that this higher tradition would survive is if they created male lines or kings to serve humanity. And I want to draw attention to the fact that I'm saying serve humanity. Everything that I'm talking about is based in sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and service. So I am not talking about interdimensional beings or space people that come to the planet to hurt you or exploit you or rule over you. That's not what this is. This is literally the organic merging of worlds along with the cosmic impulses that allow it, and higher initiates sacrificing themselves, their own soul, their own everything to come here and create an evolutionary impulse. This is very different than a lot of the conversations around human origins, around ETs, and around this kind of deep history. So we really need to understand that there is a higher order of interaction with higher worlds. There is a higher order of interaction with star beings, and there is an organic interaction as well. And so we need to know the difference, okay? So as I mentioned, this line would have been through holy birth or miraculous conception. And that is very specific because that's actually what allows the higher incarnations to come through. So those higher male essences that were going to come through and serve humanity in the patriarchal age, they needed to be born a certain way. The soul essence that made these higher kings, these avatars, needed to come directly from the solar logos. You could say it directly from what we would see as the solar logos. So when there is a conception rite going on, that feminine womb space, and she will go through a series of rituals in which she can become completely and totally receptive, and then receive a light impulse, a cosmic light impulse that is directly from the higher solar plane. And that allows for a higher child to come through, and a child that does not have any karma or the same karmic limitations as the 3D plane would impress upon them. So this was to allow very high soul essences to incarnate into the world. And sometimes you will see a image of a moon goddess, say Selene, or whatever moon goddess. This is very important to the feminine mysteries because miraculous conception is really all about getting through the moon. The moon creates a lock on the planet. So if you were able to, in your energy, be purified enough and high enough, your body would not get stuck in the energies of the moon. You'd be a master of the moon. And you would be able to conceive a child as well that's not coming from that lower astral plane. So it's kind of like for that initiate, for that female initiate, that space is completely crystal clear or very clear. That soul essence isn't getting caught in the chaos of the moon. Okay, so that was a symbol of somebody who had mastered that lunar energy. All right. So the male children also, the female children would be carrying on the same egg. So they would have the same level of wisdom. They would have the same sort of cosmic circuitry, unless they lived a life in which they degraded it and denied themselves it and kind of diluted it. They would have essentially the same cosmic circuitry as the mother, and they would be sort of able to maintain that. But with the male children, they were able to take the wisdom and the power and the cosmic exaltedness of the mother, and they were able to bring action to that in the world. They were able to actualize that, which is very, very important in the evolution of society. Okay. The way that they were able to do this was by the stars. So how the great mothers, the early female initiates at that time, were able to ritualistically pull in their sons, they were able to do so by the stars that were in the sky, which were sort of a solar essence and a representation of who is to come. And so they did their conception rituals by the stars in the sky. And during that matriarchal age, they were really laying the foundation and trying to bring in these soul essences into the life wave. They were doing these intense rituals. And by the way, when they fell to the earth, descended consciously to the earth, they didn't know if their traditional Venusian rites, their higher dimensional rites, would work on Earth. Earth was a totally different density, a heavier density. And so when you descend, everything gets garbled and mixed around and inverted. And so they actually had to spend time figuring out how to do these rites, how to make it work, and how to do it. It wasn't obvious. They had to actually use their skills in order to figure out how are we going to do this? How are we going to bring these essences through? And the whole goal was, we have to get a certain amount of these souls into the life wave so that they can enter the evolutionary stream of mankind. And as mankind moves forward, there will be these essences that can incarnate. Okay, and after the matriarchal age was ending, the earth was also going to sink deeper and deeper and deeper into materialism. And it was going to begin to descend even more. And the higher spheres were going to leave and begin to separate. And so all of this had to be done within a certain time period, which is very intense. And once the earth started to descend deeper and deeper into matter and kind of collapse like that, their conception rituals were going to become more and more and more difficult, harder and harder and harder to do, making it so near the end of the matriarchal age, it would have been impossible for most people to do, even if there was a lineage that came from a higher sphere. And there are kind of these vestiges of this great feminine culture that existed and these great female initiates. One vestige is the concept of divine right, which is that you were only really a king if you had the right bloodline. If you didn't have the right bloodline, you weren't considered a royal heir. This dates all the way back to the matriarchal age. This goes all the way back to Venus, which is why you'll often see, Quetzalcoatl identifying himself as Venus. What is he saying there? He's saying, I am of a royal line. My mother descended consciously in the matriarchal age. I am from an egg that is uncorrupted. I am a solar king. Because at the time, Venus, when I'm talking about Venus, descending and overlapping with the Earth, Venus is acting as a mitigator of solar energy. So the solar energy is so intense and powerful to our planet in the third dimension, that often a higher planet will have to overlap in the fourth dimension or so, in the etheric plane, to translate that solar energy into a manageable stream for humanity. So the idea that you couldn't be a king, that you couldn't rule, unless you had this, you didn't have divine right unless you had basically a holy mother, or it was through your feminine line. Even the Jewish tradition today acknowledges the feminine line or the mother. It still has that essence in it. And there's other tribes and civilizations too that have really acknowledged the feminine stream as kind of being the defining stream for the individual. This changed around, the Roman era, and as we sunk deeper and deeper into the more masculine influences, obviously this stopped. And but it is there, and also the myths around Melusine, the mermaid, and then Venus and Pleiades, the dove, the bee. All of this is talking about Venus and the descent of these holy women that came to the planet. And it's all kind of a steganography for that event. Okay. So there was a descent of great female initiates to the earth long ago. Their fall was a great sacrifice, and they had to take on the pain, karma, and sins of humanity in order to materialize here. They were the first teachers, and upon their descension, one of their tasks was not only to love humanity and connect it with higher spheres, but also to create a lineage of kings or higher male initiates for the coming patriarchal age.